On January 12, 1888, the temperature in Montana dropped 66 degrees in a single day. The mercury froze in its glass. The sky turned the color of hammered steel. And in the camps outside Butte, 18 people died before sunrise. But 5 months before that night, Ingrid Thorvald had never built a shelter in her life. She had never driven a nail, never mixed mortar, never raised a wall against the wind, or calculated how much heat a human body needed to survive a mountain winter. 5 months before the coldest night in Montana's recorded history, Ingrid Thorvald was standing in front of a burned-out boarding house with a carpet bag in one hand, her daughter's fingers wrapped around the other, and $43 sewn into the lining of her dress. It was August of 1887. The afternoon stage had just pulled away behind her, its wheels kicking dust onto the only good dress she owned. The dress she had worn to her husband's funeral. The dress she had worn on the 3-week journey from Minnesota. The dress that was now covered in the ash and grit of a town she did not know, in a territory that did not want her, at the edge of a hole in the earth, where men descended each day to pull copper from the rock and came up coughing blood. The boarding house was gone. Not closed, not moved, gone. The building had burned 3 months earlier. The landlady had packed what she could salvage and taken the morning coach to Helena. What remained was a rectangle of charred timber and collapsed stone, the foundation still visible beneath the wreckage, like the outline of a grave. Ingrid stood in front of it for a long time. Her daughter Britta, 7 years old, did not ask questions. The girl had stopped asking questions somewhere around the Wyoming border. When she had finally understood that her father was not coming back, that the cabin in Minnesota was not coming back, that the life she had known for all 7 years of her existence had ended the day the fever took the last breath from her father's lungs. Now she simply stood beside her mother and waited. The sun beat down on both of them. It was a different sun than the one they had known in Minnesota. Harsher, more indifferent. The air smelled of sulfur and smoke, and something metallic that Ingrid would later learn was the copper itself, the residue of smelting that hung over Butte like a permanent fog. A man passed on the street. He did not look at them. A wagon rolled by loaded with timber. The driver did not slow down. 2 women in worn dresses crossed to the other side of the street rather than walk past the widow and her child standing in front of the ruins. This was Butte, Montana in 1887. This was a town that had doubled in population twice in 2 years. A town where housing was a war and work was a lottery and survival was something you purchased day by day with whatever currency you had available. The currency Ingrid had was $43. $43 that her husband Eric had saved over 7 years of farming a plot of rocky Minnesota soil. $43 that he had hidden in a coffee tin and buried behind their cabin because he did not trust the banks and did not trust their neighbors and did not trust anything except the earth itself to keep his family's future safe. $43 that Ingrid had dug up with her bare hands 3 days after she buried him, while Britta watched from the porch with eyes that had already learned not to cry. That money was everything. That money was the distance between her daughter and the street. And now she was standing in front of a pile of ashes with nowhere to go and no one to ask, and the afternoon light already beginning to fade. She started walking. Not toward anything specific, just walking. Because standing still felt like giving up, and Ingrid Thorvald had not come 2,000 miles to give up in front of a burned-out boarding house. The streets of Butte were chaos. That was the only word for it. Men everywhere, hundreds of them, thousands of them, moving in streams toward the mine shafts that dotted the hillsides or away from them depending on the shift. The mines ran day and night, 3 shifts of workers descending into shafts that honeycombed the earth beneath the city. The ground itself was hollow here. The ground itself had been gutted and emptied and filled with the bodies of men who would never see the sun again. Ingrid did not understand this yet. She did not understand the hierarchy of the mines, the politics of the unions, the intricate dance of money and power and death that kept the copper flowing from the earth to the smelters, to the rail cars, to the cities of the East, where it would become wire and pipe, and the nervous system of a nation being built on the backs of men who coughed blood in the darkness. All she understood was that she needed a place to sleep. She found it on Mercury Street. The laundry was a narrow building wedged between a saloon and a hardware store. Steam rose from vents in the roof. The smell of lye and starch drifted through the open door. A man stood behind the counter, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, pressing a shirt with an iron that glowed orange from the heat. His name was Seamus Flannery. He was perhaps 50 years old with the weathered face of a man who had crossed an ocean and found nothing on the other side but more work. He had come from Ireland during the famine years, worked the coal mines in Pennsylvania, followed the rails west, and ended up in Butte running a laundry because his lungs had given out in the shafts, and he had been one of the lucky ones who walked away instead of being carried. He looked up when Ingrid entered. His eyes moved from her face to the child beside her, to the carpet bag in her hand, to the dust on her dress. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply waited the way men who have seen too much of the world learn to wait without expectation or judgment or hope. Ingrid asked if he knew of any rooms available. Flannery said nothing for a long moment. Then he set down the iron and walked to a door at the back of the building. He opened it. Beyond was a closet, perhaps 8 feet long, perhaps 6 feet wide. No window, no furniture, just walls thin enough to hear every conversation in the laundry and a floor made of packed earth. $4 a week, he said. Ingrid knew it was too much. She knew that $4 a week would drain her savings in less than 3 months. She knew that this closet with no window and no light and no air was not a home and would never be a home and would slowly suffocate whatever hope she had left. She paid him for 1 week. Flannery took the money without counting it. He pointed at the closet. He returned to his pressing. He asked no questions because he did not want to know the answers. That night, Britta slept on a flour sack stuffed with rags. Ingrid sat awake in the darkness, her back against the wall, listening to the sounds of the laundry through the thin boards, the hiss of steam, the thump of irons, the muffled conversations of men and women who came to collect their clothes and left without knowing that a widow and her daughter were breathing the same air on the other side of a plank wall. She counted her money, $39. She counted it again, still $39. She counted it a third time as if the act of counting might somehow produce more, might somehow multiply the bills and coins into something that could protect them from the winter that was coming. It did not. $39. 3 months of rent if she ate nothing, 2 months if she fed her daughter, 6 weeks if something went wrong. Something always went wrong. She found work within a week, not in the boarding houses, which had waiting lists that stretched for months, not in the restaurants, which paid Irish workers half wages and Swedish workers nothing at all, not in the homes of the wealthy mine owners who lived on the hill above the smelters, who sometimes hired women to cook and clean, but never hired women who arrived alone with children in tow and desperation written on their faces. She found work at the sorting house. The Anaconda Company did not send women into the mine shafts. The work below ground was for men only, and only men of a certain kind. Men who did not complain about the darkness. Men who did not complain about the dust. Men who did not complain when their partners died beside them in cave-ins and gas explosions and the slow suffocation of tunnels that collapsed without warning. But the sorting houses needed hands. Women and children who could pick waste rock from ore on conveyor belts that ran 12 hours without stopping. Women and children whose fingers were small enough to sort through the rubble. Women and children who would work for half what a man would accept because they had no other choices. Ingrid reported to the sorting house on her 7th day in Butte. The foreman's name was Brennan. He was a Cornishman like many of the mine bosses. The Cornish had been working tin and copper for centuries in the hills of their homeland, and they had brought their expertise to the American West, along with their accents and their meat pies and their superstitions about the spirits that lived in the rock. Brennan looked at Ingrid the way Flannery had looked at her. The same evaluation, the same calculation, the same weighing of her worth against the limited resources of a world that had no room for weakness. He told her the pay was $1.10 per day. He told her the shift was 12 hours. He told her that most sorters lasted 3 months before the coughing got too bad to continue. Then he said something that Ingrid would remember for the rest of her life. He said, "Everyone here is buying time. The question is what you are buying it for." Ingrid did not answer. She did not know yet. The sorting house stood at the edge of a gulch that ran northwest from the mines toward the mountains and the mountains. The building was long and low, made of rough timber and sheet metal, with windows so caked with dust that the sunlight entered as a gray haze rather than illumination. Inside, the conveyor belts ran without stopping. The ore came up from the shafts in carts dumped onto the belts and carried past rows of women and children who sat on wooden benches and picked through the rubble with their bare hands. The valuable rock went into one bin, the waste rock went into another. The dust rose into the air with every movement filling the lungs of everyone who breathed it. Ingrid took her place on the bench. The woman beside her was perhaps 40 years old, though she looked 60. Her hands were cracked and blackened. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Her breathing was a constant wheeze, a sound like wind through broken shutters. She did not speak. None of them spoke. They worked. Hours passed. The conveyor belt did not stop. The ore kept coming. The dust kept rising. And Ingrid picked through the rubble until her fingers bled and her back ached and her lungs burned with every breath. At some point during that first day, she looked up. Through the filthy windows, she could see the hills beyond the sorting house. The tailings piles mountains of crushed rock that the company dumped in the valleys. The streams that ran orange with runoff. The bare earth where nothing grew and nothing would ever grow again. And beyond the tailings, something else. Steam. Thin columns of white vapor rising from the hills, catching the afternoon light, twisting and dissipating in the wind. She asked Brennan about the steam during the 15-minute break that the sorters were allowed for eating. Hot springs, he said. Whole country is riddled with them. Water comes up boiling out of cracks in the rock. The miners used to bathe in them before the company bought up everything worth owning. Some of the old-timers still talk about pools hot enough to cook an egg. Ingrid asked if anyone lived out there. Brennan laughed. In the tailings, only the ones too broke or too crazy to live anywhere else. Company does not care as long as they stay out of the works. He walked away. Ingrid watched the steam rise. She did not know why it mattered to her. She did not know why her eyes kept returning to those thin white columns, why her mind kept circling back to the heat that must be beneath them, the warmth that came from deep in the earth where winter was a meaningless word. She did not know yet, but something had taken root. The weeks passed. August became September. September became October. The days grew shorter. The nights grew colder. And Ingrid's lungs grew weaker. The coughing started in the second week of October. Dry at first, just an irritation in her throat that would not go away. Then wet, producing phlegm that she spat into rags and hid from Britta. Then flecked with black, the dust itself coming up from her lungs, evidence that the mine was inside her, now that she was breathing out the same ore she had been sorting for 2 months. She knew what it meant. Everyone in Butte knew what it meant. The company doctor was a man named Mercer. He maintained an office near the main shaft, a cramped room that smelled of whiskey and carbolic acid with a desk covered in papers and a shelf of medicine bottles that had not been touched in years. Mercer was a drunk. Everyone knew that too. But he was the only doctor the company provided, and the company did not provide him for the benefit of the workers. They provided him so that someone with a medical degree would be available to sign the death certificates when the miner stopped breathing. Ingrid went to see him on a Thursday afternoon. She told him about the coughing. She told him about the blood. She told him about the black dust that came up when she spat. Mercer listened without interest. He had heard this story 1,000 times. He would hear it 1,000 times more before his own liver finally gave out and someone else took his place behind the desk. When she finished, he told her what he told everyone. Miner's consumption. Theate in the rock gets into the tissue. Nothing to be done except stop breathing the dust. Ingrid asked what would happen if she stopped working. Mercer shrugged. Then you stop eating. Most sorters get a year, maybe less with how much blood you are showing. He paused. He looked at her with eyes that had seen too many widows and too many orphans and too many lives extinguished before their time. You have a daughter, he said. I hear she waits for you outside the sorting house every evening. Ingrid said nothing. Mercer leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked. Somewhere outside, a steam whistle blew. Might want to make arrangements, he said. Ingrid left his office. She walked through the streets of Butte in a daze. The noise washed over her without registering. The crowds parted around her without her noticing. Her feet carried her forward while her mind spun through the same calculations over and over again. 1 year, maybe less. 1 year to provide for a daughter who would be 8, then 9, then alone in a world that had no mercy for orphans. 1 year to find a way out of the sorting house, out of the dust, out of the death sentence that was already written in her lungs. 1 year, maybe less. She found herself standing at the edge of the gulch, looking out at the tailings and the hills beyond them. The steam was still rising, thin white columns against the darkening sky. She stood there until the sun went down. The following week, everything changed again. Seamus Flannery came to her on a Tuesday evening. He stood in the doorway of the closet where she and Britta had been living for 2 months, his face set in an expression that was not quite apologetic and not quite indifferent. He needed the room back. Winter was coming. The seasonal miners were arriving by the trainload, men who worked the shafts from November to March when surface work became impossible, then scattered to railroads and ranches when the ground thawed. They needed places to stay. They had money to pay. Flannery's closet could fit 2 of them, maybe 3, if they did not mind being close. He was sorry. He gave her a week's notice. He refunded $2. He told her to try the camps. Ingrid did not argue. There was nothing to argue about. And Flannery was not a cruel man. He was simply a man trying to survive in a town that did not have enough room for everyone who needed it. His sympathy was real. His decision was final. The camps were beyond the tailings. She had seen them from the sorting house, a scattering of structures along the hillsides where the company dumped its waste. Shacks built from salvaged lumber. Canvas tents stretched over frames. Dugouts carved into the earth. She had heard stories about the camps. They were where people went when they had nothing left. The failed miners. The widows whose arrangements had ended badly. The families too poor to afford even a shared room in a boarding house. They were the bottom of Butte's hierarchy, below the workers, below the laborers, below everyone else who still had a foothold in the world. Ingrid packed her carpet bag. She took Britta by the hand. They walked out of the laundry into the October cold, past the saloons and the hardware stores, and the crowds of miners heading toward the shafts, past the company offices and the smelters and the rail yard, past the last of the real buildings into the wasteland of crushed rock and poisoned streams where the company dumped everything it did not want. The camps were worse than she had imagined. People lived in structures that were not structures at all. Sheets of canvas draped over poles, crates nailed together with whatever scraps could be salvaged, holes in the hillside covered with boards and lined with rags. The residents looked at Ingrid and Britta with flat eyes, the eyes of people who had stopped expecting anything from the world and simply endured whatever it gave them. She found a spot on the 3rd day of November, a patch of relatively level ground near a creek that ran down from the hills. The water was warm, not hot, but warm. Steam rose from it in the morning cold. She was examining the ground, trying to determine if it was stable enough to build on when a voice spoke behind her. "That is the overflow." She turned. The man was perhaps 45 years old, though he looked 60. His face was weathered and gaunt, lined with the kind of creases that came from years of squinting in darkness and breathing air that was more dust than oxygen. He leaned on a crutch made from a broken shovel handle. His left leg hung at an angle that meant it had been shattered and never properly set. His name was Ezekiel Cotter. "Zeke," he said when Ingrid asked. "Everyone calls me Zeke." He had been a miner until a cave-in crushed his leg 3 years ago. Now he survived on odd jobs and charity, and the occasional coin that someone dropped into his palm when they passed him on the street. He lived in a canvas tent 30 yards from the creek, a tent that had been patched so many times it was more thread than fabric. He pointed at the steam rising from the water. "Hot springs up the hill," he said. "Water runs down, cools off, ends up here. Gets warmer the closer you get to the source." Ingrid asked how close you could get. Zeke studied her. He was not a stupid man. The mines did not tolerate stupidity. The men who worked the shafts had to calculate stress loads and air quality and the probability of collapse on a daily basis. The ones who could not calculate did not last long. He knew what she was thinking. "You are thinking what I think you are thinking," he said. Ingrid told him she was thinking it was going to be a cold winter. Zeke laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "Lady, it is always a cold winter. That is why people pay for rooms with stoves. That is why they burn coal. You cannot live on hot water." Ingrid told him she was not planning to live on hot water. "Then what are you planning?" She did not answer. She was not sure yet. The hot springs were a mile up the creek, past the tailings, past the last of the shacks into a narrow valley where the ground itself seemed to breathe. Steam rose from cracks in the rock. Pools of water bubbled and hissed. The air smelled of sulfur, not overpowering, but present, a constant reminder that this was not ordinary ground. Ingrid made her first trip to the valley on a Wednesday afternoon. She left Broda with a woman in the camp who had agreed to watch her for a nickel. She told the woman she would be back before dark. She took nothing with her except a candle and a box of matches. The walk took an hour. The terrain was rough, broken rock and loose scree that shifted under her feet with every step. The creek grew warmer as she climbed until she could see steam rising from it, even in the middle of the day. The pools appeared first as patches of discolored earth, then as actual water bubbling up from vents in the rock and collecting in depressions before overflowing downhill. She did not touch the pools. She had heard stories about people who had fallen into hot springs in Yellowstone, their skin boiling off before they could scream. These pools might not be that hot, but she was not going to find out by accident. She was looking for something else. She did not know what yet, but she would know it when she found it. She made 5 trips to the valley over the next 2 weeks. Each time she went a little further. Each time she examined the terrain more carefully. She was not looking for a pool. A pool would flood her shelter or scald her daughter. She was not looking for a steam vent. The steam vents shot water into the air at unpredictable intervals, geysers in miniature that could not be controlled or contained. She was looking for heat without water. Heat that came from the earth itself. Heat that would not kill her. On her 5th trip, she found it. The fissure was on a granite shelf about halfway up the valley. A crack in the rock and perhaps 8 feet long and 2 feet wide from which a steady column of warm air rose into the cold. She approached it carefully. She knelt beside it. She held her hand over the opening. The air was hot. Not boiling, not dangerous, but hot. Like standing over a bread oven when the door was open. Like the warmth that radiated from a cast iron stove hours after the fire had gone out. She held a rag over the fissure. The rag grew warm, then damp with condensation. But not wet, no visible steam, just heat radiating up from somewhere deep in the earth. She stayed beside the fissure for an hour. She watched the air rise. She felt the heat on her face. She breathed the smell of sulfur fainter here than at the pools but present. And she began to think. The shelf was high. That was the first thing she noticed. The fissure was not in a low spot where gases might collect. It was on elevated ground with the terrain dropping away on 3 sides into the valley below. The air was moving. That was the second thing. The heat rose steadily upward, not pooling, not settling, just rising and dissipating into the sky. She lit the candle. She held it over the fissure. The flame burned steady and yellow. No flickering, no color change. No sign of the heavy gases that Brennan had mentioned, the invisible killers that pooled in low spots and suffocated men before they knew they were dying. She watched the flame for a long time. Then she blew it out and walked back to the camp. That night she asked Zeke about the smell. His face changed. The tired resignation hardened into something sharper. Something like fear or anger or both. "You found a vent," he said. "A dry vent." Ingrid asked if that was bad. Zeke grabbed her arm. His grip was stronger than she expected from a man with a crushed leg and nothing to eat but charity. His fingers dug into her flesh hard enough to leave bruises. "Lady," he said, "do you know what comes out of those things? It is not just hot air. It is sulfur gas, carbon gas, stuff that will kill you before you know you are breathing it. Miners die in those vents all the time. Walk into a pocket of bad air, drop dead where they stand. Nobody finds them for weeks." He looked at her with eyes that had seen too many deaths. "I pulled a body out of one of those vents in '79, he said. A Swede who thought he had found a warm place to sleep. He was dead before he hit the ground. The gas collects in low spots. It pools like water. You build a shelter over that thing, you will wake up dead. If you wake up at all." He let go of her arm. "You have a daughter," he said. "Find another way." Ingrid rubbed the place where his fingers had been. She looked out at the valley, at the steam rising from the hills, at the distant glow of Butte smelters painting the sky orange. She did not say what she was thinking. She was thinking that there was no other way. She was thinking that her money was down to $11. She was thinking that her lungs were getting worse every day, that the blood in her sputum was darker, now that the pain in her chest when she breathed was sharper. She was thinking that winter was 6 weeks away, and she had no coal, no wood, no fuel of any kind. She was thinking about her daughter sleeping on a flour sack in a canvas tent while the temperature dropped and the snow fell and the cold crept in through every gap in the fabric. She was thinking about the fissure, the high ground, the moving air, the steady yellow flame that did not flicker or change color. She was thinking that Zeke was right about the danger. and she was thinking that he might be wrong about this particular vent. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the darkness of their makeshift shelter listening to Britta breathe beside her, counting the money she had left. $11. Enough for 2 months of food if she bought nothing else. Enough for 1 month of food and shoes for Britta, whose feet had outgrown her old pair and were developing blisters from walking on the rocky ground. Not enough for coal. The coal sellers did not deliver to the camps. You had to carry it yourself from the depot a mile away. And the men who controlled that depot did not sell to camp dwellers at any price. Not enough for wood. The timber was controlled by the company. What little scrap was available had already been claimed by people who had been in the camps longer than her. Not enough for rent. Not that rent mattered anymore. The closet behind the laundry was gone. The boarding houses were full. There was nowhere to go even if she had the money to pay. $11. And winter was coming. She got up before dawn. She walked to the edge of the camp and looked out at the valley. The steam was rising in the gray light, thin white columns against the hills. She thought about Eric, her husband, dead 6 months now, buried in a churchyard in Minnesota that she would never see again. He had been a careful man, a patient man, a man who measured twice and cut once and never made a decision on without thinking it through. He would have told her not to do it. He would have told her that the risk was too great, that the case was too dangerous, that there had to be another way. But Eric was dead, and Ingrid was alive, and Britta was alive, and she was going to keep it that way. She went back to the fissure that afternoon. She brought the candle again. She brought rags. She brought a length of rope so she could lower things into the crack and pull them back up. She spent 3 hours testing. She lowered the candle into the fissure on the rope. The flame burned steady at every depth. No flickering, no color change. She wet the rags and held them over the opening. They dried quickly in the rising heat, but showed no discoloration, no residue that might indicate toxic gases. She lay face down beside the fissure with her nose inches from the crack. She breathed. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. Her head did not swim. Her vision did not blur. The air smelled of sulfur and tasted of minerals, but she could breathe it. She sat up. She looked at the shelf where the fissure opened. High ground, 3 sides dropping away into the valley. Any heavy gas would flow downhill away from the opening, away from anything built above it. She looked at the air rising from the crack. Steady, constant, moving upward. Not pooling, not collecting, moving. She thought about what Zeke had said. The Swede who died in '79. The gas that collected in low spots. The miners who walked into pockets of bad air and dropped dead where they stood. Low spots. This was not a low spot. Pockets. There were no pockets here. The air moved too fast. She was not a scientist. She was not an engineer. She was a widow with $11 and a daughter who would freeze to death if she did not find shelter before the snow came. But she could observe. She could test. She could think. And she could make a choice. Ingrid Thorvald made her choice that afternoon, kneeling beside a crack in the rock with the smell of sulfur in her nose and the heat of the earth rising around her. She was going to build. She walked back to the camp as the sun was setting. Zeke was sitting outside his tent, mending a tear in the canvas with a needle made from a fishbone and thread made from unraveled rope. He looked up a tub as she approached. He did not ask where she had been. He already knew. She stopped in front of him. The light was fading. The temperature was dropping. Somewhere in the camp, a child was crying. "I am going to build over the fissure," she said. Zeke did not respond. "I am going to build walls from mud and straw. I am going to make them thick enough to hold the heat. I'm going to leave a vent at the top so the air keeps moving. And I am going to keep my daughter alive through the winter." Zeke looked at her for a long time. The needle glinted in his weathered hands. The thread hung loose. The tear in his tent remained unmended. "You are going to die," he said. "Maybe. You are going to wake up dead, and that daughter of yours will freeze alone." "Maybe not." Zeke shook his head. "I have seen what those vents do. I have seen the bodies. I have carried them out and buried them and watched their families weep. You think you are different. You think you are smarter than the Swede who died in '79. You think the rules do not apply to you." Ingrid looked at him. She did not argue. She did not try to convince him. She simply said, I have $11. I have a daughter, and I need winter heat I cannot buy. Then she turned and walked back to her shelter. Zeke watched her go. The needle hung motionless in his hands. The tear in his tent remained unmended, and the steam kept rising from the hills, thin, white columns against the darkening sky, indifferent to doubt, indifferent to fear, indifferent to the choices that desperate people made when they had no other choices left. November came. The first snow fell on the fourth day of the month, and Ingrid Thorvald began to build. The first snow came on November 4th. It was not a heavy snow, not the killing snow that would come later. Just a dusting, a thin white layer that covered the tailings in the camp and the hills beyond, softening the edges of the wasteland, making it look almost beautiful in the gray morning light. Ingrid stood at the edge of the camp and watched it fall. Britta was beside her, wrapped in a blanket that had been mended so many times it was more thread than wool. Her breath came out in small, white clouds. Her cheeks were red from the cold. She did not complain. She had stopped complaining weeks ago. The snow melted by noon, but the message was clear. Winter was no longer coming. Winter was here. The killing months had begun, and anyone who was not prepared would not see spring. Ingrid went to work. The sorting house was even worse in the cold. The dust mixed with moisture from the workers' breath, creating a fog that hung in the air and settled on everything. The conveyor belts ran slower because the machinery was stiff. The ore was harder to sort because fingers went numb after the first hour. Ingrid worked her 4 days that week. She coughed blood into rags that she hid in her dress. She collected her $4.40, and on her days off she climbed the hill to the fissure and began to gather materials. The scrap piles around the tailings were picked over, but not empty. The company dumped everything here, not just rock, but broken equipment, shattered crates, splintered beams from collapsed tunnels. Most of it was worthless. Some of it could be salvaged. Ingrid learned to see value in things others had discarded. A beam that was rotten on one end might be solid on the other. A crate that had been smashed could yield 6 or 7 usable boards. Nails could be pulled from debris and straightened. Rope could be unraveled and rewoven. Canvas that was too torn for a tent could be cut into smaller pieces for other purposes. She hauled materials up the hill one load at a time. The terrain was brutal, rocky and steep, with loose scree that slid under her feet and threatened to send her tumbling back down with every step. The loads were heavy, her shoulders ached, her lungs burned. The coughing fits came more frequently now, sometimes so violent that she had to stop and lean against a rock until they passed. But she kept climbing, load after load, day after day. Britta watched her mother work. The girl sat on a rock near the fissure, wrapped in her tattered blanket, her eyes tracking every movement Ingrid made. She did not offer to help. She was too small to carry the loads, too young to understand the engineering that her mother was working out in her head. But she watched. And sometimes when Ingrid looked at her daughter's face, she saw something that might have been hope. Zeke watched too. He did not come up the hill. His crushed leg made the climb impossible. But from his position in the camp below, he could see the granite shelf where Ingrid was piling her salvaged materials. He could see the smoke from her small fires when she tested the wind direction. He could see her silhouette against the sky as she measured and planned and prepared. He did not offer to help either, but he watched. The frame went up on the 1st of December. It was the simplest structure Ingrid could design, an A-frame the shape that a child might draw if asked us to picture a piece 8 feet long, 6 feet wide at the base, tapering to a peak 4 feet above the ground. The logic was elementary. An A-frame could be built with minimal materials. The angled walls would shed snow instead of collecting it. The low profile would present less surface area to the wind, and the shape would allow the heat from the fissure to rise naturally toward the peak, where it could escape through a vent hole without pooling inside the structure. The scrap lumber was warped and rotten in places. Ingrid did not care. She selected the strongest pieces for the frame. She reinforced the weak spots with additional bracing. She drove salvaged nails through joints that did not quite fit and bound them with rope when the nails were not enough. The frame was ugly. The frame was crude. The frame would hold. The walls were the problem. Canvas would not hold heat. The material was too thin, too porous. Heat would radiate through it as fast as the fissure produced it, and canvas would tear in the wind leaving gaps that cold air could exploit. Scrap wood was better, but not much. The boards were too thin, too full of gaps where they did not meet properly. Even if she could find enough lumber to cover the entire frame, the structure would leak heat like a sieve. What she needed was mass. Something thick enough to trap the warmth rising from below. Something dense enough to block the winter wind. Something that would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly through the night. She found her answer in the creek. The clay deposits along the warm water were thick and workable, softened by the geothermal heat that permeated the ground. She could dig it with her bare hands. She could carry it up the hill in buckets salvaged from the tailings. She could mix it with straw from the stable near the company office's straw that the stable hands threw away by the wagon load. Mud and straw, the oldest building materials in human history. The same materials that people had used to build shelters for 10,000 years, long before lumber mills and brick factories and the Industrial Revolution that had created the mines that were slowly killing her. Ingrid began plastering on December 3rd. The process was backbreaking. She carried clay up the hill in a broken bucket that leaked half its contents on every trip. She gathered straw from the stable, stuffing it into a canvas bag and dragging it up the rocky slope. She mixed the clay and straw with water from the warm creek, working it with her hands until it reached the consistency of thick paste. Then she applied it to the frame, one layer at a time. She started at the bottom, spreading the mixture over the rough lumber in a coating perhaps 2 inches thick. The warmth rising from the fissure dried each layer, slowly baking it like pottery in a kiln. When one layer was dry, she added another, then another, then another. The walls grew thicker. The structure began to take shape, and Zeke began to climb. He appeared on the 4th day of construction, pulling himself up the slope with his crutch digging into the rocky ground, his crushed leg dragging behind him. The climb took him nearly an hour. By the time he reached the granite shelf, his face was gray with exhaustion, and his breathing was ragged. He stood at the edge of the work site, leaning on his crutch, staring at what Ingrid had built. The frame was almost complete. The walls were perhaps 6 inches thick at the base, tapering as they rose toward the peak. The mud was drying in the heat from below, turning from brown to gray as the moisture evaporated. Zeke did not speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was flat. "You are building a coffin." Ingrid did not stop working. She scooped another handful of mud from her bucket and pressed it against the wall, smoothing it with her palm. "A mud coffin over a poison hole," Zeke continued. "That girl of yours is going to watch you die in there." Ingrid kept plastering. Her arms trembled with fatigue. Her lungs ached with every breath. The clay was cold against her skin, but the wall beneath it was warm, heated by the earth itself. She did not argue with him. She did not try to explain. She simply worked. Zeke watched her for another few minutes. Then he said, "I am not watching." Ingrid paused. She looked at him. His face was weathered and gaunt, the face of a man who had seen too many people die to believe anyone could survive. His eyes held something that might have been anger, or might have been fear, or might have been grief for a death that had not happened yet. "Then do not watch," she said. She turned back to her wall. She heard his crutch scraping against the rock as he made his way back down the slope. The sound grew fainter and fainter until it disappeared entirely. When she looked again, he was gone. The days grew shorter. The temperature dropped. December 5th, December 6th, December 7th. Ingrid worked from first light until she could no longer see her hands in front of her face. She carried clay and straw up the hill until her muscles screamed for rest. She plastered layer after layer onto the growing walls until her fingers cracked and bled from the cold and the alkaline bite of the mud. Britta sat on her rock and watched. Sometimes she sang softly to herself, old songs in Swedish that Ingrid had taught her, songs that Eric had sung when they were still a family in Minnesota before the fever, before the journey, before everything fell apart. The sound of her daughter's voice kept Ingrid going. When her arms gave out, she thought of that voice. When her lungs seized with coughing fits, she thought of that voice. When the wind picked up and the temperature plunged, and every rational part of her mind screamed that she was going to die on this hillside building a structure that would become her tomb, she thought of that voice. And she kept working. December 10th. The walls were 12 inches thick at the base, now tapering to 6 inches at the peak. The entrance faced away from the prevailing wind, a gap in the structure just large enough for a person to crawl through. A vent hole at the top of the A-frame allowed the warm air to escape, preventing it from pooling inside. Ingrid stood back and looked at what she had built. It did not look like much. A mound of dried mud protruding from the granite shelf, gray-brown against the snow that had begun to accumulate on the surrounding rocks. From a distance, it might have been a natural formation, a deposit left behind by some ancient geological process. But inside, it was warm. She crawled through the entrance and lay on the dirt floor, feeling the heat rise from the fissure beneath her. The air was moist and mineral-scented, tinged with the faint smell of sulfur that she had learned to associate with survival. The walls radiated warmth that they had absorbed from the earth itself. She held her hand over the crack in the rock. Still hot, still steady, still breathing. December 12th. She worked on the entrance, building a lip around it that would prevent wind from driving directly into the structure. She gathered flat stones from the hillside and arranged them in a path leading to the opening so that she and Britta would not track mud inside. December 13th, she reinforced the vent hole with a collar of sticks and mud, ensuring that it would not collapse under the weight of snow. She tested the airflow by lighting a small fire inside the shelter and watching the smoke rise and exit through the hole. The draft was strong. The air moved. December 14th, she made one final inspection. The walls were solid, 18 inches thick at the base, tapering to 6 inches at the peak. The entrance was protected from the wind. The vent hole was functioning. The heat rose from the fissure in a steady column, warming the small space to perhaps 50 degrees, while the outside temperature hovered at 20. The shelter was complete. That night, she lay awake in the canvas tent she and Britta had been sharing with 2 other families. The cold crept through every gap in the fabric. The wind made the walls billow and snap. Someone's child was crying. Someone's father was coughing, the same wet cough that Ingrid had learned to recognize as death approaching. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow we move. December 15th, 1887. Ingrid packed their belongings into the carpet bag that had carried everything she owned from Minnesota to Montana. There was not much. A change of clothes for herself, a change of clothes for Britta, the blanket, the flour sack that served as a mattress, a small pot for cooking, a knife, a box of matches. Everything they had in the world fit into a single bag. She took Britta by the hand. They walked through the camp. People watched them go, the flat eyes of the desperate tracking their movement without comment or question. A woman building a mud shelter over a poison vent. A child following her mother into what everyone knew was death. Just another tragedy in a place that had seen too many tragedies to count. No one tried to stop them. No one offered to help. They climbed the hill. The path was familiar, now worn into Ingrid's memory by weeks of repetition. She knew every rock, every switchback, every spot where the footing was treacherous. She guided Britta around the dangerous sections, lifting her over obstacles, catching her when she stumbled. The granite shelf appeared above them. The shelter sat in the center, gray-brown against the white snow, steam rising faintly from the vent hole at its peak. Britta stopped. She looked at the structure. She looked at her mother. "Is that our house?" she asked. It was the first question she had asked in weeks. Ingrid knelt beside her daughter. She brushed a strand of hair from the girl's face. She looked into eyes that held too much understanding for a 7-year-old. "Yes," she said. "That is our house." Britta nodded. She did not ask if it was safe. She did not ask if they would survive. She simply took her mother's hand again and walked toward the entrance. They crawled inside. The warmth hit them immediately. After weeks of cold, after months of shivering through nights in drafty rooms and leaking tents, the sensation was almost overwhelming. Heat rising from the ground, heat radiating from the walls, heat surrounding them, embracing them, holding them in a cocoon of warmth that seemed impossible in a world that had been nothing but cold for so long. Britta sat down on the dirt floor. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders. She looked up at her mother. "It is warm," she said. Her voice held wonder, disbelief, something that might have been the beginning of hope. Ingrid sat down beside her. She pulled her daughter close. She did not speak. She simply held her child and felt the heat rise around them and waited. Night came. The temperature outside dropped. Through the small gap around the entrance covering, Ingrid could see the stars emerging bright and hard and cold in the December squanite. The wind picked up, whistling across the granite shelf, probing the walls of the shelter for weaknesses. The walls held. The heat continued to rise. Ingrid did not sleep. She sat with her back against the wall, feeling the warmth through the mud, listening to the wind outside, and the steady breathing of her daughter beside her. She watched the darkness. She waited for the headache, the dizziness, the confusion that would signal the beginning of the end. She waited for death. Death did not come. Hours passed. Britta slept deeply, more deeply than she had slept in months. Her breathing was even and slow. Her face was relaxed. The tension that had become her permanent expression since Minnesota had softened into something approaching peace. Ingrid watched her daughter sleep. She thought about Eric. She thought about the cabin they had left behind. She thought about the journey west, the endless miles of prairie and mountain, the strangers who had looked at them with pity or contempt or indifference. She thought about the fissure beneath them, the crack in the earth that was keeping them alive. And she thought about Zeke. "You will wake up dead." The words echoed in her mind. But she was not dead. She was warm. She was alive. And her daughter was sleeping beside her. The first light of dawn crept through the grass around the entrance. Gray light, cold light. The light of a December morning in Montana when the sun barely cleared the horizon before beginning its descent again. Ingrid had not slept. Her body was exhausted. Her mind was foggy. But she had made it through the night. She had made it through the night. Britta stirred. The girl's eyes opened slowly. She looked around the dim interior of the shelter, orienting herself, remembering where she was. Her gaze found her mother's face, and she smiled. It was the first smile Ingrid had seen from her daughter since Minnesota. Mama Britta said, "I am not cold." Ingrid pulled her daughter close. She buried her face in the girl's hair. She did not cry. She had forgotten how to cry somewhere between Minnesota and Montana, somewhere between burying her husband and standing in front of a burned-out boarding house, somewhere between hope and survival. But she held her daughter, and she whispered, "No, you are not cold." Word spread through the camp. By the end of the first week, everyone knew. The Swedish widow had built a shelter over a hot vent. She had moved in with her daughter. They had not died. They were not even sick. Smoke rose from the entrance when she cooked. Heat rose from the vent hole, even in the coldest weather. The structure sat on the granite shelf like something out of a fever dream, impossible and undeniable. People came to see. First the curious, then the skeptical, then the hostile. A woman named Hulda Magnusson climbed the hill on December 20th. She was perhaps 50 years old, Swedish like Ingrid, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a face that had been hardened by decades of disappointment. She had been in Butte for 3 years. She had buried a husband in the mines and a son in the camps. She had survived by selling herself to miners until her body gave out, and now she survived on charity and spite. She stood at the entrance of the shelter and looked inside. Ingrid was cooking. A small pot hung over a fire built from scrap wood positioned near the entrance where the smoke could escape. The smell of boiling oats filled the air. Britta sat in the corner wrapped in her blanket watching. Hulda did not enter. She stood in the cold and stared. "It is a trick," she said finally. "You are burning something in there. Stolen coal. Maybe you are selling yourself to get it." Ingrid looked up from her cooking. "There is no stove. There is no coal. Look for yourself." Hulda looked. She saw the dirt floor. She saw the mud walls. She saw the crack in the rock from which warm air rose in a steady column. She saw no stove. She saw no coal. She saw no fuel of any kind. Her face twisted. "It is the devil's work," she said. Then she turned and left. Others came after her. Some believed, some did not. Some simply stared and shook their heads and returned to their freezing tents and their dwindling coal supplies and their slow march toward death. Ingrid did not try to convince anyone. She did not argue. She did not explain. She simply lived. She cooked meals for herself and Britta. She reinforced the walls where the mud had cracked. She gathered more straw to spread on the floor for insulation. She carried water from the warm creek and stored it in a bucket near the entrance where it would not freeze. And every night she lay awake and listened to her daughter breathe and waited for the death that Zeke had promised. It did not come. December 21st, December 22nd, December 23rd. On the morning of December 23rd, Zeke climbed the hill. Ingrid heard his crutch scraping against the rock before she saw him. The sound was labored, punctuated by long pauses. The climb was harder now than it had been 3 weeks ago. The snow was deeper, the ice was thicker. And Zeke was not a young man. He appeared at the edge of the shelf, breathing heavily, his face gray with exertion. Ingrid was sitting outside the shelter, mending a tear in Britta's dress. The sun was pale but present, and she had learned to take advantage of the light when it was available. She did not speak. She waited. Zeke made his way across the shelf. He stopped at the entrance of the shelter. He looked inside. He stood there for a long moment, feeling the warm air on his face, seeing the impossible made real. When he turned back to Ingrid, his expression was different. The anger was gone. The fear was gone. In their place was something that might have been confusion or wonder or the beginning of acceptance. "You are still alive," he said. "I am still alive." The girl sleeping. She has not coughed in 3 days. Zeke stared at the shelter. He reached out and touched the wall. The mud was warm under his fingers. "I do not understand," he said. "I have seen men die in vents like this. I have seen them drop without a sound." Ingrid set down her mending. She looked at the old miner, at the weathered face and the crushed leg and the eyes that had seen too much death. "Maybe this one is different," she said. Zeke shook his head. "Maybe you are lucky. Maybe." Ingrid stood. She walked to the entrance of the shelter and looked inside. Britta was curled on the floor, wrapped in her blanket, her breathing slow and even. Or maybe she said, "I watched, and I tested, and I did not build in a low spot where the boss could pool. Maybe I paid attention." She turned back to Zeke. "I cannot tell you which it was. I do not know myself. But I am alive. My daughter is alive, and we are warm." Zeke did not respond. He stood at the entrance of the shelter for a long time, feeling the heat on his face, watching the steam rise from the vent hole. Then he turned and began the long climb back down. He did not say goodbye. He did not offer congratulations. But he did not call her a fool either. Not anymore. Christmas came and went. Ingrid did not celebrate it. There was nothing to celebrate with. No gifts, no decorations, no special meal. Just another day of survival in a world that demanded survival every single day. But she told Britta about Christmas. She told her about the celebrations they had known in Minnesota, the tree that Eric would cut from the forest, the candles they would light, the songs they would sing in Swedish and English. She told her about the snow falling outside the cabin windows, about the smell of pine and wood smoke, about the way her father would lift her onto his shoulders so she could place the star on top of the tree. Britta listened. She did not cry. She had forgotten how to cry too. But she listened, and she remembered, and somewhere in her 7-year-old mind, she stored these memories alongside the others, the good and the bad, the joy and the grief, the life they had lost and the life they were building. The year turned. 1888, the coldest year in Montana's history, had begun. January brought deeper cold. The temperature dropped below zero and stayed there. The snow piled up in drifts that buried the lower structures in the camp. The creek froze at its edges, though the center remained liquid, warmed by the geothermal springs that fed it. Inside the shelter, life continued. Ingrid had developed a routine. She woke with the first light, or what passed for first light, in the depths of winter, when the sky shifted from black to gray and the world emerged from darkness. She built a small fire near the entrance to cook breakfast, using the wood sparingly because it was precious and difficult to gather. She fed Britta. She tended the shelter, checking for cracks in the walls, clearing snow from the entrance, ensuring that the vent hole remained open. In the afternoon, she made trips to the camp below. She could no longer work at the cutting house. Her lungs had deteriorated too far. The last time she had tried to work a shift, the coughing had become so severe that Brennan had sent her home, his face set in the expression of a man who has signed too many death certificates to feel anything anymore. But she could trade. She traded knowledge. How to find clay that would not crack when it dried. How to mix straw in the right proportions. How to identify vents that might be safe and vents that were certainly dangerous. She did not charge for this information. She gave it freely to anyone who asked. In return, she received small things: a bag of oats, a piece of salt pork, a pair of mittens that someone's wife had knitted before she died, a length of rope, a pot to replace the one that had cracked. She was not getting rich. She was not even getting comfortable. But she was surviving. And so was Britta. The girl had changed in the weeks since they moved into the shelter. The haunted look was fading from her eyes. The permanent tension in her shoulders was beginning to relax. She still did not laugh. She still did not play. But she spoke more often now, asking questions about the shelter, about the heat, about the strange world they had found themselves in. She was curious again. That was something. January 2nd. January 3rd, January 4th. On the 4th of January, the first death came. A man named Johansson who had been living in a canvas tent near the edge of the camp. He had been burning scrap wood in a tin bucket to stay warm. The fire had gone out sometime in the night. By morning, he was ice. Ingrid heard about it from a woman who climbed the hill to ask about building a shelter. She told the woman what she knew. She did not promise anything. She simply shared what she had learned, and the woman went away with the knowledge, and Ingrid returned to her routine. January 5th, January 6th. The temperature continued to drop. The sky turned a color that Ingrid had never seen before, a kind of pale white that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The air grew drier. The snow stopped falling because there was no moisture left in the atmosphere. These were warning signs. Ingrid did not recognize them. She had not lived through a Montana winter before. She did not know what the pale sky meant. She did not know what the dry air meant. She did not know that somewhere to the north on the high plains of Canada, a mass of Arctic air was building, gathering strength, preparing to descend. She simply continued her routine. She tended the shelter. She fed her daughter. She waited. January 7th, January 8th, January 9th. On the 9th of January, Zeke climbed the hill again. He had not come since Christmas. The cold had been too severe. His leg had been giving him trouble. But something had driven him up the slope today, something that put urgency in his movements and tension in his face. Ingrid saw him coming. She waited at the entrance of the shelter. When he reached the top, he was breathing hard. His face was flushed despite the cold. His eyes were fixed on the sky. "You need to prepare," he said. Ingrid looked at him. "Prepare for what?" Zeke pointed at the horizon. "Storm coming. Big one. I have never seen clouds like that." Ingrid looked. To the north where the mountains met the sky, a bank of clouds was forming. Not normal clouds, not snow clouds. Something different. Something that seemed to pulse with energy, that seemed to move even as she watched. "How bad?" she asked. Zeke shook his head. "I do not know, but bad. Worse than anything I have seen in 9 winters." He looked at the shelter. He looked at Ingrid. "You might want to come down," he said. "Find better shelter in town." Ingrid did not respond. She looked at the clouds. She looked at the shelter. She thought about the heat rising from the fissure, the steady warmth that had kept them alive for 3 weeks, the walls that had held against the wind and the cold and the doubt. "This is our shelter," she said. Zeke stared at her. Then he shook his head. "You are either the bravest woman I have ever met," he said, "or the craziest." "Maybe both," Ingrid replied. Zeke almost smiled. "Almost." Then he turned and began the climb back down, moving faster than he had on the way up, driven by the same urgency that had brought him. Ingrid watched him go. Then she turned and looked at the clouds again. They were closer now, moving faster. She spent the rest of that day preparing. She gathered every scrap of wood she could find and stacked it near the entrance. She filled every container she had with water from the creek. She brought in the food supplies she had stored outside. She checked the walls for cracks and filled them with mud. She reinforced the entrance covering with an extra layer of canvas weighted down with stones. By evening, the clouds had swallowed half the sky. By the time she and Britta crawled into the shelter for the night, the first gusts of wind were beginning to probe the granite shelf. Ingrid pulled her daughter close. She felt the heat rising from the fissure, and she waited. January 12, 1888, the day the world ended. It did not end with fire. It did not end with flood. It ended with cold, a cold so absolute and so complete that it seemed to reach into the very bones of the earth and freeze them solid. At noon, the temperature in Butte stood at 12 degrees above zero. Cold, but survivable. The kind of cold that miners had worked through for years, the kind of cold that people in the camps had learned to endure. You wore extra layers, you kept moving, you burned whatever fuel you could find. You survived. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees below zero, a drop of 30 degrees in 3 hours. The wind arrived with it. It came from the north, from the high plains of Canada, from places where the cold had been building for weeks, like water behind a dam. When the dam broke, the wind carried temperatures that had no business existing outside of the Arctic. By 6 o'clock, it was 40 degrees below zero. The sorting houses closed. The mines suspended operations. Men who had been working the surface camps abandoned their posts and fled toward the city, toward buildings with walls thick enough to hold back the killing cold. Many of them did not make it. By midnight, the instruments at the company office stopped working. The mercury in the thermometers had frozen solid. Later reports would estimate that the temperature reached 65 degrees below zero in the valleys around Butte. Later, they would call it the worst cold snap in Montana's recorded history. Later, they would count the dead and shake their heads and write articles for newspapers back east about the savage wilderness and the people foolish enough to try to tame it. But on the night of January 12th, there was no later. There was only now. There was only the cold. There was only survival. Ingrid had been watching the sky all morning. The clouds that had been building for 2 days had finally arrived, a solid wall of gray that stretched from horizon to horizon, blotting out the sun, turning the day into a twilight that seemed to belong to no particular hour. When the wind changed around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she knew. She did not know the words for what was coming. She did not have the vocabulary of meteorology, the science of pressure systems and Arctic fronts and temperature inversions. But she knew in the way that animals know when a predator is approaching, in the way that the body knows when death is near. Something terrible was coming. She pulled the canvas tighter over the entrance. She gathered Britta close. She waited. The first gust hit around 5 o'clock. It was not like normal wind. Normal wind pushed and pulled and ebbed and flowed. This wind was a solid force, a wall of moving air that slammed into the shelter like a physical blow. The walls shuddered. The entrance covering billowed inward, straining against the stones that held it in place. Britta cried out. Ingrid pulled her closer. "It is just wind," she said. "The walls will hold. We are safe." She did not know if she believed it, but she said it anyway. The hours that followed were the longest of Ingrid's life. The wind did not stop. It screamed across the granite shelf, finding every gap, every crack, every place where the mud had dried unevenly or the canvas had pulled loose. Cold air poured in through openings she had not known existed. The temperature inside the shelter, which had held steady at 50 degrees for almost a month, began to fall. 50 degrees. 45. 40. Ingrid blocked the entrance with everything she had. She pulled the canvas tighter. She stuffed rags into the gaps. She packed mud from the floor into the spaces where the wind still whistled through. Her fingers went numb from the cold. Her breath came in clouds that crystallized the moment they left her mouth. But she kept working. The temperature stopped falling at 38 degrees. Outside, it was 50 below zero and dropping. Inside, it was 38 degrees and holding. The difference between those two numbers was the difference between life and death. Sometime around midnight, there was a pounding at the entrance. Ingrid froze. The pounding came again, frantic, desperate, the sound of a fist against frozen canvas. She crawled to the entrance and pulled back the covering. Zeke fell through the opening. His face was white. His lips were blue. Ice crystals clung to his beard and his eyebrows and the thin hair that poked out from under his cap. He was shaking so violently that his whole body seemed to vibrate. "Tent," he gasped. "Gone." Wind took it. Ingrid pulled him inside. She dragged him toward the fissure, toward the heat rising from the crack in the rock. She covered him with blankets. She rubbed his hands and his feet, trying to force blood back into the frozen extremities. Britta watched from the corner, her eyes wide and dark. Zeke's shaking slowly subsided. His color began to return. He lay on the floor of the shelter, staring up at the mud walls, feeling the warmth that should not have existed in a world that had turned to ice. How he whispered. Ingrid did not answer. She did not need to. The fissure answered for her. Heat rose from the crack in the rock, steady and constant, indifferent to the apocalypse above. The first night was the hardest. The three of them huddled together near the fissure, their bodies pressed close, sharing warmth, sharing breath, sharing the desperate hope that the walls would hold, and the heat would continue, and the morning would eventually come. Outside, the wind screamed. It sounded like a train. It sounded like 1,000 trains, all of them roaring toward the shelter. At once, all of them determined to tear it apart and scatter its contents across the frozen wasteland. But the walls held. The mud had dried slowly, baked by the heat from below, hardening into something that was almost stone. The A-frame shape let the wind flow over it rather than against it. The low profile presented minimal surface area. Heat rose from the fissure in a steady column indifferent to the chaos above. Heat that had been building for millions of years, fuel that would not run out in a single night or a single winter or a single lifetime. The same fire that had pushed mountains up from the seafloor, that had cracked continents apart, that had been burning since before there were humans to fear it. That fire was keeping them alive. At some point during the night, Britta fell asleep. Ingrid did not know how a child could sleep through that wind, through that cold, through the constant awareness that death was inches away on the other side of the wall. But children were resilient. Children adapted. Children slept when sleeping was possible because they had not yet learned to fear sleep the way adults did. Ingrid did not sleep. She watched the entrance. She watched the canvas. She watched the small hole at the peak of the shelter where the warm air escaped. As long as that air was moving, they were breathing clean. As long as the heat kept rising, they were alive. Zeke did not sleep either. He lay on his back near the fissure, his eyes open, staring at nothing. His tent was gone. Everything he owned was gone. The crutch he had been using for 3 years, the blankets he had accumulated, the small collection of tools and supplies that represented his entire worldly possessions. All of it was scattered somewhere in the darkness, buried under snow, lost forever. He had nothing now, nothing except his life, and a widow who had been crazy enough to build a shelter over a crack in the ground. Dawn came, if it could be called dawn. The sky lightened from black to gray, but the sun never appeared. The wind had picked up snow from the valleys below and turned the air into a wall of white. Visibility dropped to nothing. The world beyond the entrance of the shelter had ceased to exist. The cold deepened. Ingrid had no thermometer. She did not need one. She knew what 60 below felt like now. She knew it in her bones, in the way her breath crystallized the moment it left her mouth, in the way the canvas over the entrance had frozen stiff as a board despite being 3 feet from the fissure. She also knew what was happening in the camps below. She could not see them. She could not hear them over the wind. But she knew. The canvas tents that had housed half the camp dwellers. Gone. Shredded or buried. The dugouts that had been barely adequate in normal cold. Death traps now. The scrap wood fires that everyone had been burning for warmth. Useless against temperatures that sucked heat from a flame faster than the flame could produce it. People were dying down there. She knew it with the certainty of someone who had calculated odds and found them hopeless. And yet here in a mud shelter built over a crack in the ground, her daughter was sleeping. The second day was worse. The wind dropped for a few hours in the early morning, and the silence was so sudden and so complete that Ingrid thought she had gone deaf. Then the cold settled in heavier, denser, more absolute than before. Without the wind to stir the air, the temperature plunged even further. The moisture in Ingrid's breath froze on her eyelashes. The mud walls of the shelter, which had been damp from condensation, turned to ice on the inside. Frost formed on the blankets on the floor on every surface that was not directly above the fissure. But the fissure kept breathing. Ingrid measured the heat by holding her hand over the crack. Still warm, still rising, still enough. That afternoon, Britta developed a fever. It started as a cough, the same cough that Ingrid herself had been fighting for months. The miner's cough, the sorting house cough, the sound of lungs trying to expel dust that would not leave. But in a child in a shelter with no medicine, in a storm that made travel impossible, a cough could become something worse. By evening, Britta's forehead was hot to the touch. Her breathing had turned shallow and rapid. She muttered in her sleep fragments of Swedish, the language Ingrid had not spoken since leaving Minnesota, the language her daughter should not have remembered. But fever did strange things to memory. Fever opened doors that had been closed. Fever brought back the dead. Papa, Britta whispered. Papa var, du Papa, where are you? Ingrid held her daughter and did not answer. Papa was gone. Papa had been gone for 6 months. Papa was not coming back. Zeke sat up. His face was pale in the dim light. His eyes were fixed on the child. She needs a doctor, he said. There is no doctor. She needs medicine. There is no medicine. Zeke stared at her. The shelter was 38 degrees warm enough to survive, cold enough to see breath. Outside it was 60 below and getting colder. The wind had returned, howling around the granite shelf, driving snow into drifts that would bury anything left exposed. Then what do we do? He asked. Ingrid did not answer. She did not know what to do. She had built a shelter that could hold heat. She had not built a shelter that could cure a fever. She pulled Britta closer to the fissure. The warm air rose around them, both moist, mineral-scented, the breath of the earth itself. She wrapped her daughter in every blanket they had. She held her against her own body, trying to transfer warmth, trying to fight the fever with heat. She remembered what Zeke had said about the vents, about the gas that pooled in low spots, about the men who had died without knowing they were dying. What if she was wrong? What if the thing keeping them warm was also making Britta sick? She pushed the thought away. She could not think about that now. She could only think about keeping her daughter alive. The second night was longer than the first. Ingrid did not sleep. She held Britta through the darkness, feeling the child's body burn with fever, listening to her labored breathing, watching for signs that the sickness was getting worse. The hours crawled by. Midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. At some point, Zeke crawled over and sat beside her. He did not speak. He simply sat there, his presence a silent witness to the struggle, his body adding its warmth to the small circle around the fissure. At 4 o'clock, Britta's breathing changed. It became more ragged, more desperate, the sound of lungs fighting for air that they could not process. Ingrid felt panic rising in her chest. She had come so far. She had built this shelter with her own hands. She had survived the first night of the storm, and the second day, and the second night. She had kept her daughter warm when everyone else was freezing to death. And now, in the darkness before dawn, she was going to lose her anyway. Not to the cold, to the fever, to the sickness that had been waiting inside her daughter's lungs since the first day they had set foot in Butte. Ingrid began to cry. She had forgotten how to cry somewhere between Minnesota and Montana. She had thought the tears had dried up, burned away by grief and exhaustion and the endless demands of survival. But they had not dried up. They had been waiting, and now they came streaming down her face, freezing on her cheeks, falling onto her daughter's burning forehead. She cried for Eric dead in a churchyard 2,000 miles away. She cried for the life they had lost, the cabin in Minnesota, the future that would never be. She cried for herself, a widow with $11 and a dying child alone at the end of the world. And she cried for Britta, 7 years old, who had never complained, who had never asked why, who had simply followed her mother into the wilderness and trusted that everything would be all right. Mama. The voice was small, weak, but clear. Ingrid looked down. Britta's eyes were open. The fever flush was still on her cheeks, but her gaze was focused, present, aware. Mama, why are you crying? Ingrid could not speak. She gathered her daughter in her arms and held her tight, feeling the small heart beating against her own, feeling the warmth that was not fever but life, feeling the breath that came easier now, steadier, stronger. The fever had broken. She did not know when. She did not know how. Perhaps the warmth from the fissure had helped sweating out the sickness. Perhaps Britta's body had simply fought off whatever infection had taken hold. Perhaps it was luck or chance or something that could not be explained by logic or reason. She did not care. Her daughter was alive. Her daughter was awake. Her daughter was going to survive. The third day, January 15th, 1888, the wind had died. The sky was clear for the first time in 3 days, a pale blue so bright it hurt to look at. The sun hung low on the horizon, a cold white disk that provided light but no warmth. The storm was over. Ingrid crawled to the entrance and pulled back the frozen canvas. The world outside was transformed. Everything was white. The granite shelf, the hills below the valley, the distant mountains. The snow had drifted into shapes that looked almost architectural, waves and peaks and valleys of white that covered everything that had been there before. The camp was invisible, buried, silent. Zeke appeared beside her. He looked out at the whiteness, at the stillness, at the absence of movement or sound or life. I need to see, he said. Ingrid nodded. She watched him crawl through the entrance and struggle to his feet. His crushed leg was worse after 2 days of inactivity, stiff and painful. But he made his way down the slope, his crutch sinking deep into the snow, with every step his body leaving a trail through the whiteness like a wound. He was gone for 2 hours. Ingrid waited. She fed Britta a thin gruel made from the last of their oats. She melted snow for water. She tended the fire that kept the chill at bay. And she waited. When Zeke returned, his face was the color of old ash. He did not climb back up to the shelter. He stopped at the edge of the granite shelf, leaning on his crutch, his body trembling with exhaustion or cold or something else entirely. Ingrid went to him. 18, he said. The word hung in the air between them. 18 what? 18 bodies that I found. He paused. His eyes were fixed on some middle distance, seeing things that were not there or things that were there but should not have been. There are more under the snow. I could see the shapes, the mounds where the drifts had covered them. Ingrid did not speak. Johansen's tent is buried, Zeke continued. The wind must have ripped it apart before the heavy snow came. I found him 20 yards from where it used to stand. He was crawling toward the creek, toward the warm water. He did not make it. He fell silent. Then he went on. The family near the creek, the Andersons, parents and 2 children. The dugout collapsed. The snow drove in through the gaps. They were frozen together, holding each other. The children were in the middle. His voice cracked. He had seen death before. He had seen it in the mines, in the cave-ins, in the house leaks, in the slow suffocation of men who ran out of air. He had pulled bodies from the earth, identified them for the company records, watched their families weep. But he had never seen anything like this. Hulda Magnuson, he said, the one who called your shelter the devil's work. I found her in what was left of her dugout. The roof had caved in. She was curled up in a ball, her hands black with frostbite. He looked at Ingrid. His eyes were wet. How are you alive? Ingrid looked at the shelter behind her, the mud walls, the steam rising from the vent hole, the crack in the earth that breathed heat into a world that had turned to ice. The earth, she said. The earth kept us warm. Zeke stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and looked back down at the valley, at the white wasteland that had been a camp, at the shapes beneath the snow that had been people. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. Word of the deaths spread slowly. The storm had killed not just in the camps, but throughout the region. Miners caught between shifts, travelers on the roads, families in isolated cabins. The death toll would eventually reach into the hundreds, though no one would ever know the exact number. But word of the survivors spread too. By the end of January, everyone in Butte knew about the widow who had built a shelter over a hot vent. They knew about the 3 people who had lived through the worst night in Montana's history in a structure made of mud and straw. They knew about the fissure that breathed heat from the earth, about the walls that had held against the wind, about the impossible survival that defied everything the old-timers thought they knew. Some called it luck. Some called it madness. Some called it a miracle. Brennan came up the hill in early February. The foreman walked slowly, his boots crunching through the crusted snow, his breath trailing behind him in clouds. He had heard the stories. He had dismissed them at first the way he dismissed most of the tales that came out of the camps. Survival myths, exaggerations, the kind of desperate lies that people told themselves when the world turned against them. But the stories had persisted, and so he had come to see for himself. Ingrid met him at the entrance of the shelter. She did not invite him inside. She simply stood there, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes meeting his without apology or explanation. Brennan looked at the structure. He looked at the steam rising from the vent hole. He reached out and touched the wall. The mud was warm under his fingers. You built this yourself, he asked. Yes. No coal. No. No wood. No fuel. The earth is the fuel. Brennan was silent for a long moment. He was not a man who admitted error easily. Foremen never were. But something in his expression had shifted, some calculation behind his eyes that was revising what he thought he knew about the world. I told you once that everyone here was buying time, he said finally. I asked you what you were buying it for. I remember. You never answered. Ingrid looked at the shelter. She looked at the fissure beneath it. She looked at the landscape below, white and silent, marked by the shapes of graves that had not yet been dug. I was buying time to figure out how to stop buying time, she said. I was buying time to find a way to live that did not require me to die slowly in your sorting house. She turned back to him. This is what I found. Brennan did not answer, but when he left, he did not tell her to vacate the company's land. He did not send men to tear down the shelter. He did not do anything at all. For a company foreman, that was as close to approval as Ingrid was likely to get. The survivors came next. First one, then another, then a steady stream of the desperate and the curious and the hopeful, all of them climbing the hill to see what the widow had built, all of them wanting to understand how she had lived when so many had died. A man named Gunnar Hedlund came on the 20th of February. He had lost his wife and his son to the cold. He had survived because he had been in Butte proper when the storm hit, working a night shift in one of the warehouses. By the time he made it back to the camp, his family was already dead. He stood at the entrance of the shelter for a long time. He looked at the walls. He looked at the fissure. He felt the warm air on his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with grief. "How did you know it would work?" Ingrid considered the question. She could have lied. She could have claimed certainty, authority, knowledge that she did not possess. She could have made herself into a prophet, a visionary, someone who had seen what others could not see. But she did not. "I did not know," she said. "I hoped." Gunnar looked at her. "But you tested it," he said. "Before the storm, you tested the vent." Ingrid nodded. "I watched the air. I watched the flame. I built where the ground was high so the gas would not pool. I made the walls thick so the heat would stay." She paused. "I did what I could. I observed what I could observe. I tested what I could test. But I cannot tell you whether I survived because I was careful or because I was lucky. I do not know myself." Gunnar was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. He did not seem disappointed by the answer. If anything, he seemed relieved, as if honesty were worth more than certainty, as if the truth of her doubt was more valuable than the lie of her confidence. "I want to build one," he said. "Can you show me how?" She showed him. She showed everyone who asked. By the end of February, 3 more shelters had gone up along the granite ridges above the camp. Crude structures, mud and timber, imitations of Ingrid's original, built over vents that she had helped identify and test. Not every vent was safe. She found 2 that made her dizzy within minutes. She found 2 more that smelled so strongly of sulfur that her eyes watered from 20 feet away. These she marked with stones, warning others to stay away. But she also found 4 that seemed clean. High ground, moving air, steady heat. The survivors built on those 4. Spring came slowly. The snow melted in patches, revealing the frozen earth beneath, revealing the bodies that had not yet been recovered, revealing the wreckage of the camp that the storm had destroyed. The dead were buried in a mass grave outside the city. There was no ceremony. There was no priest. There was only a company crew with shovels and picks digging through the half-frozen ground, dropping the bodies into the hole one by one. Ingrid did not attend. She had no connection to the dead except geography, except the shared experience of poverty and desperation, except the knowledge that she had been one decision away from being among them. She stayed in her shelter and watched the steam rise and thought about the winter that had passed. Zeke stayed through the winter. He never quite admitted that he had been wrong. He never said the words that would acknowledge his prediction of coffins and poison and a dead girl watching her mother die. But he stayed. He helped maintain the shelter. He taught Britta to whittle, carving small figures from scraps of wood while the girl watched with fascination. He told her stories about the mines, about the darkness below the earth, about the men who had gone down and the men who had come up and the men who had never returned. He was not a father. He did not try to be, but he was a presence, a voice, a pair of hands that could fix what was broken and build what was needed. And when the spring thaw finally came in April, he was still there. "I'm going back to the city," he said one morning. Ingrid was sitting outside the shelter, mending a tear in Britta's dress. The sun was warm for the first time in months. The snow had retreated to the highest peaks. The creek was running fast and clear, swollen with meltwater. She looked up at him. "There is work now," Zeke continued. "The company is hiring for the summer shifts. Surface work, nothing underground. You will ruin what is left of your leg. Probably." He smiled. It was a rare expression on a face that had forgotten how. "But I have to eat. Cannot live in a mud hut forever." Ingrid set down her mending. She looked at the old miner, at the weathered face and the crushed leg, and the eyes that had seen too much and somehow still found a way to keep looking. "You could stay," she said. "No," Zeke shook his head. "This place," he said, "it saved my life, and I am grateful. But it is yours. You built it. You understood it. I just watched and waited to see if you would die." He paused. "I am glad you did not." He left that afternoon. Ingrid watched him make his way down the slope, his crutch digging into the soft earth, his body leaving a trail through the mud like a signature. She did not see him again until the following winter, when he returned to the camps with a new crutch, in a new tent, and a new determination to survive another season. By then, there were 7 mud shelters on the granite ridges. The years passed. The method spread slowly at first, then faster as the stories traveled. By the winter of 1889, a dozen families had built geothermal shelters in the valleys around Butte. By 1890, the practice had reached other mining districts: Anaconda, Helena, the silver camps near Phillipsburg. Not everyone succeeded. The gas remained a danger. Two men died in poorly sited shelters before the decade was out. One had built in a low spot where the heavy gases collected. The other had chosen a vent that looked safe but produced invisible poison. Their deaths were tragedies, but they were also lessons. The survivors learned. They taught. They refined the knowledge that Ingrid had discovered by necessity and desperation, and the refused to accept that death was the only option. Test before you build. Build high, keep the air moving. Watch the flame. These became the rules, the commandments of geothermal survival, passed from person to person, camp to camp, year to year. Ingrid never charged for her advice. She never patented the design. She showed anyone who asked. She answered every question she could answer. She admitted freely when she did not know. The shelters were never common. Most people preferred conventional fuel. Most land did not have usable vents, but they existed. They saved lives. That was enough. Britta grew. She turned 8 in the shelter on the granite shelf. She turned 9 in a larger structure that Ingrid had built beside the original, connected by a covered passage that kept the heat from escaping. She turned 10 helping her mother plaster walls for other families, mixing clay and straw with hands that had grown strong and capable. The haunted look had left her eyes years ago. The silence had been replaced by questions. Endless questions about the earth and the heat and the way things worked. About her father dead in Minnesota. About her mother alive and working and building. She was not a happy child. Happiness was not something that came easily in the camps. Not something that could be purchased with $11 or built from mud and straw. But she was alive. She was learning. She was becoming someone. And that was more than most children in the camps could say. 1893. The fire came in August. It started in the lower camp in a shack where someone had been careless with a stove. The dry summer had turned the scrap lumber and canvas into tinder. The wind carried the flames uphill, jumping from structure to structure, consuming everything in its path. By the time Ingrid saw the smoke, the fire had already reached the granite ridges. She grabbed Britta. She ran. Behind them, the shelter that had kept them alive through the coldest winter in Montana's history burned to the ground. The mud walls cracked in the heat. The timber frame collapsed. The entrance that had welcomed them through 5 winters fell inward and disappeared. The fissure remained. The earth kept breathing, but the shelter was gone. Ingrid stood on a hillside above the destruction, her daughter beside her, watching the smoke rise into the August sky. She had lost everything. Again. For the second time in her life, she had built something and watched it burn. But this time was different. This time she was not alone. This time she had skills and knowledge and a reputation. This time she knew how to survive. She moved to Helena. The city was larger than Butte Cleaner, less dominated by the mines and the company. She found work as a laundress, then as a seamstress, then as an assistant to a midwife who needed someone steady and calm and unafraid of blood. Britta grew into a young woman. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn chin. She had learned to read in the camps, taught by a miner's widow who had been a school teacher before her husband died. She had learned to write and to figure and to think in ways that Ingrid had never been taught. She was going to be something. Ingrid knew it. She could see it in the way her daughter looked at the world, in the questions she asked, in the hunger for knowledge that burned in her like the fire that had burned beneath the granite shelf. In 1901, Britta married a railroad clerk named Thomas Anderson. He was a quiet man, a steady man, a man who would never dig copper from the earth or build shelters over volcanic fissures or do anything particularly remarkable. But he loved Britta, and Britta loved him, and that was enough. They moved to Seattle, where the railroad company had transferred Thomas. Ingrid visited twice, traveling by train across the mountains that she had once thought were the edge of the world. Seattle was green and wet and mild. The winters were nothing compared to Montana. The summers were cool and pleasant. Britta was happy there. She had children of her own, 2 boys who would never know what it meant to sleep in a canvas tent while the temperature dropped to 60 below. Who would never know what it meant to count their mother's money and find only $11. Who would never know what it meant to survive. They would know other things, they would face other challenges. But they would not know what Britta knew, and perhaps that was a blessing. Ingrid returned to Helena after her second visit. Her lungs had been getting worse for years. The damage from the sorting house had never healed. The dust that she had breathed in those 12-hour shifts had settled into her tissue and stayed there, slowly suffocating her from the inside out. She knew she was dying. She had known it for a long time, but she was not afraid. She had built a shelter over a crack in the earth when everyone told her she would die. She had kept her daughter alive through the coldest night in Montana's history. She had taught others to survive, and they had taught others. And somewhere out there in the valleys and the mountains and the mining camps, people were still living because of what she had discovered. That was enough. That was more than enough. Ingrid Thorvald died on March 15, 1907. She was 52 years old. The cause of death was listed as pulmonary failure, the medical term for lungs that had finally stopped working. The same death that claimed thousands of miners and sorters and anyone else who had spent too many years breathing the poison air of the copper industry. She was buried in Helena in a small cemetery on a hillside overlooking the valley. Britta came for the funeral. She stood beside the grave while the minister spoke words that seemed inadequate for the woman who lay beneath the earth. She held her husband's hand and watched the dirt fall onto the coffin and thought about all the things she would never be able to say. Thank you, I love you. I understand now. The mourners dispersed, the grave was filled, and Britta Anderson, née Thorvald, returned to Seattle to raise her children and live her life and remember her mother in the quiet moments when memory was all she had left. The fissure is still there. The shelter is not. Fire and time and a century of neglect have erased every trace of the structure that once stood on the granite shelf above Butte. The camps are gone, the miners are gone, the copper industry that once dominated the region has moved on to other places, other methods, other ways of extracting wealth from the earth. But the heat still rises. If you climb the hill today, past the abandoned tailings and the overgrown trails and the ruins of a world that no longer exists, you can find the spot where Ingrid Thorvald built her shelter. You can feel the warm air rising from the crack in the rock. You can smell the faint sulfur scent that she learned to associate with survival. The earth does not remember her. The earth does not remember anyone. The earth simply breathes as it has breathed for millions of years, as it will breathe for millions more. Heat rising from the fire below. Steam curling into the sky. The same energy that pushed mountains up from the seafloor, that cracked continents apart, that has been burning since before there were humans to feel it. Ingrid Thorvald knelt beside this fissure in November of 1887. She had $11. She had a daughter who was going to freeze if she did not find shelter. She had no skills, no training, no knowledge except what she could observe and test and figure out for herself. And she had a choice. She could accept what everyone told her, that the vents were dangerous, that the gas would kill her, that there was no way to survive a Montana winter without coal or wood or the money to buy them. Or she could refuse. She could watch and test and think. She could observe the air and the flame and the way the ground rose and fell. She could use her hands to build something that had never been built before, a shelter that drew its heat not from burning fuel, but from the fire at the heart of the earth itself. She could believe that the world might give her something instead of taking everything away. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 66 degrees in a single day. 18 people died in the camps. The mercury froze in its glass. And Ingrid Thorvald woke up warm, her daughter sleeping beside her, the earth breathing heat into a space that everyone said would be her tomb. She did not wake up dead. She woke up alive. And the fire beneath the granite still burns today, indifferent to memory, indifferent to doubt, waiting for the next person desperate enough to believe that survival is possible when everyone else says it is not.